Okay, let's unpack this. We are embarking on a deep dive today into an event that can sometimes feel like just a footnote in the sprawling history of the Napoleonic Wars.
But it's so much more than that.
So much more. It really defines one of the greatest military disasters of all time. We're looking at the Battle of Borodino, fought on September 7th, 1812.
Single day.
Just one single day. And our mission today is pretty straightforward. We're going to extract the key insights from the sources about this pivotal engagement.
And we need to understand not just what happened, but why it mattered.
Exactly. How this battle didn't just determine the fate of Napoleon's, catastrophic Russian campaign, but how it fundamentally introduced a terrifying new scale of attrition warfare to Europe.
And to really hook you in, we have to start with the single most shocking fact about Borodino. This was, statistically, the bloodiest single-day battle of the entire Napoleonic Wars.
It's an incredible claim when you think about that era.
An era defined by massive armies and, overwhelming firepower. And yet Borodino just stands completely alone in its horror.
And when we talk about the scale, we should be really specific. Our sources indicate that the combined forces engaged that day, French and Prussian, totaled somewhere between, 250,000 and 280,000 troops.
250,000 men. And here is the truly impossible number. Out of that 250,000, the combined casualties in just about 12 hours of fighting are estimated between 70,000 and 80,000 soldiers.
Killed or wounded.
Killed or wounded. That's a casualty rate of nearly 30%. It's an almost unimaginable toll for a single day's fighting in 1812.
So our deep dive has to focus on that central paradox. How could a battle that Napoleon technically claimed as a victory?
A tactical victory.
Right, a tactical victory. How could that simultaneously seal the fate of his entire army? We're really analyzing why Borodino was the moment that operational exhaustion became, permanent.
It's the point of no return.
Okay, let's set the stage a bit. The timeline here is just crucial. Napoleon's Grande Armée had invaded Russia back in June of 1812.
And they were moving quickly, devastatingly so. But by September, they were already running into very deep trouble.
And this is where strategy becomes high-stakes politics. The commander of the Russian forces, General Mikhail Kutuzov, had been executing this textbook Fabian strategy.
A very careful, very controlled, deliberate retreat for months.
And the goal was simple, right?
Oh, very simple. Stretch Napoleon's already strained supply lines to their breaking point. Use the sheer, vast depth of Russian territory as your primary defense. Let the country swallow the army.
It's easy for us, in retrospect, to call that brilliant. But at the time, the Russian public, the nobility, they must have been furious.
Absolutely furious. The French were approaching Moscow. And the pressure on Kutuzov was just immense. He was facing cries of cowardice, of treason, because he kept giving up sacred Russian land. Borodino, which is about 75 miles west of Moscow, was the place where he just couldn't afford to retreat anymore.
It was a politically necessary stand then.
Completely. The goal wasn't even to destroy Napoleon's army. It was to inflict such a high cost that the French advance was delayed, national honor was satisfied, and most importantly, the Russian army survived to fight another day.
That political necessity really dictated the military setup. The Russians didn't just meet them in an open field.
No, not at all. They heavily fortified their position. The topography there was ideal for a defensive line, and they anchored it with these massive earthworks we need to talk about.
Yes, the battlefield preparations tell you everything about the desperate nature of this defense.
If you look at the tactical maps, you see two key names that just define the whole Russian line. First, you have the Great Redoubt.
Right in the center.
A massive arrow-shaped earthwork right in the center of the line. It was a bastion, basically, designed to absorb and deflect the main French assault.
And then, crucially, you have the Bagration Flèches. 3 smaller V-shaped fortifications. They were anchoring the Russian left flank. So what was the tactical thinking there?
Well, they were critical defensive salients. Because they jutted out from the main line, they prevented the French from easily performing a successful flanking maneuver.
So they forced the French to attack head-on.
Exactly, head-on into converging fire. These weren't subtle field defenses. These were elaborate, dug-in positions that basically screamed that the Russians intended to bleed the Grande Armée dry right there.
This wasn't a battle of maneuver then, not a classic Napoleonic strategy.
Not at all. This was a prepared siege of an entrenched field army.
And the sources show that the battle instantly devolved into what must have been just an absolute hellscape.
Oh, a complete hellscape. Because the Russians were dug in, The fighting just became these devastating artillery duels followed by massive repeated infantry assaults.
The sound alone must have been shattering.
Unimaginable. We're talking about thousands of cannons firing nonstop for hours. The infantry was forced to charge and then recharge those earthworks one assault right after another.
It was a close-quarters, grinding engagement.
Defined by sheer brutality. And wave attacks against prepared positions. This is why the casualty numbers are so astronomical. There was no opportunity for skillful evasion. It was just blunt, face-to-face mass killing.
Let's dive back into those grim statistics, and let's look at the French side first. The reports indicate French losses somewhere between 28,000 and 32,000 men, killed or wounded.
Which is a crippling loss in a single day, no matter how you look at it.
It's catastrophic. But the Russian losses were numerically even worse.
Yeah, hovering around 44,000 to 47,000 casualties. This speaks to the desperation and, I guess, the efficacy of their defensive preparations, but also their willingness to pay an incredibly high price.
And that terrible toll included key Russian commanders. The loss of Prince Bagration, one of their most capable and beloved leaders. He died from wounds he sustained fighting for those very flèches that bore his name.
Bagration's death is a tragic turning point within the battle itself. On a tactical level, it demoralized the troops fighting near him. It probably contributed to the French eventually seizing the Flèches.
But strategically?
Strategically, it seems to have had this powerful, almost spiritual reverse effect. His sacrifice, alongside the sheer scale of blood that was spilled, it galvanized this furious resolve across the rest of the army and, crucially, back home in Russia.
So the French gained ground.
But they created a blood feud.
What really stands out to me in the sources is the historical perspective on this carnage. They are definitive. This scale of devastation, this level of killing over a single 12-hour period using Napoleonic-era technology. It was unmatched in European warfare until the start of World War I.
100 years later.
Over a century later.
That statement fundamentally reframes Borodino, doesn't it? It sets a terrifying precedent for industrial-scale killing, even before the industrial age provided modern weaponry.
It's just the sheer concentration of force.
The concentration of fire, the dedication of the troops, and the absolute unwillingness of either side to yield. It created a military environment that feels more like the trenches of 1914 than the maneuver battles of 1805.
So we arrive at this central paradox. Napoleon claimed victory, and by the time darkness fell, his army held the key fortifications. The Russians were retreating east, back toward Moscow.
He had technically defeated them in the field.
But this is where we have to really define the term Pyrrhic victory, especially in this context.
Exactly. Napoleon held the field. That is, by definition, a tactical win. But if we connect this to the bigger picture of the whole campaign, he failed at the fundamental strategic mission.
Which was?
To destroy the Russian army.
What does it even mean for an army to retreat intact after losing 45,000 men? How did Kutuzov even maintain coherence?
It means the command structure remained functional. The core mass of the army, though it was severely battered, was not routed. They retreated in good order. They preserved their cannon, their supply trains, and their ability to regroup and replenish.
So Napoleon inflicted massive damage.
Massive. But he left the enemy operational, and that distinction is just vital. He won the ground, but he lost the ability to dictate any future terms.
And this failure, coupled with his own staggering losses, it just irreparably damaged his operational capacity deep inside Russia.
He could not afford to lose 30,000 of his best troopsmen who had marched thousands of miles to fight and then expect the rest of the campaign to go smoothly. It's impossible.
So Borodino wasn't just a bloody battle.
No, it was the moment. The moment that the Russian attrition strategy proved successful, even if it cost them more lives. It was the fatal bleeding of the Grande Armée. It guaranteed that even if Napoleon reached Moscow, his force would be strategically exhausted.
So if we shift focus now from the tactical fight to the long-term fallout, we have to look at what this massive cost actually bought him.
It bought him entry into a ghost town.
Moscow.
The battle contributed directly to the severe logistical collapse that was already plaguing the invaders. I mean, think about it. Every soldier lost meant one fewer mouth to feed, yes, but it also meant one fewer soldier available to forage, one fewer to guard those endlessly stretching supply lines.
And one fewer to fight the inevitable Russian counterattacks.
Precisely. Borodino weakened the supply chain just as much as it weakened the hiding line.
And on the Russian side, despite all the carnage, Borodino really highlighted General Kutuzov's strategic resilience. He took those terrible losses, but he used that moment of defense to reinforce the Russian will.
And he successfully pulled off the required retreat, preserving his army for the campaign's next and ultimately fatal stage.
This is the historical turning point.
It absolutely is. The scale of the bloodshed fueled Russian nationalism and resolve like nothing else could have. The suffering at Borodino was used as propaganda. It galvanized the nation against the invaders.
So it transformed the conflict.
It transformed it from a war between empires into a patriotic defense of the homeland.
It turned the invasion from a potentially conquering military maneuver into a national defense movement fueled by memory and revenge.
Yes. And Borodino ensured that Napoleon would find no peace, no negotiated settlement, and in the end, no success in Russia.
That single day of fighting, September 7th, 1812, was less about immediate conquest for Napoleon and more about the fatal strategic bleeding that just paved the way for the devastating retreat from Moscow later that year.
The beginning of the end.
So we've explored the numbers, the agonizing intensity, and the profound strategic failure inherent in Napoleon's costly win at Borodino. It truly was the battle where winning meant losing everything.
And we have to return to that astonishing fact that the sources emphasize, that the carnage at Borodino was described as unmatched until World War I. Just think about the implications of that for military science.
It's a heavy thought.
It is. This was a battle fought purely with the tools of the late 18th century. Muskets, bayonets, cannons. There are no rapid-fire weapons, no aviation, no barbed wire yet defining the defensive landscape.
So for commanders across Europe, just witnessing or even reading the reports of 70,000 casualties in a single day using those seemingly primitive tools,
it must have psychologically altered their entire expectation of what warfare could be. It signaled that human endurance and sheer will, even without advanced technology, could generate industrial-scale slaughter.
which raises a powerful question for you to consider. If 12 hours of battle in 1812 could yield casualties that rival the worst days of the American Civil War, what truly defines the limits of human conflict? How much of modern warfare's lethality is truly dependent on technology versus sheer, raw determination to hold a patch of ground?
Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're setting aside the grand strategy, the geopolitical maneuvering, and we're focusing on one thing: the butcher's bill.
And for one very specific, monstrous day.
Exactly. We're talking about the Battle of Borodino, fought on September 7, 1812, between Napoleon's Grande Armée and the Russian imperial forces.
It's a clash of giants.
It really was. And we've got a stack of historical records here, memoirs, military analyses, and they're all wrestling with the same question. What was the true human cost of that single day?
And the sources make it clear the figures are chaotic. They're contested.
So our mission for you today is pretty simple. We're going to try and cut through that numerical fog to really get a handle on the sheer scale of the carnage.
It's a tough task.
It is. So just to set the stage, when we talk about Borodino, we're talking about a colossal engagement.
Colossal is the word. You have roughly 250,000 soldiers, about 250,000 men locked in combat on one massive front.
Just the density of it alone guarantees huge casualties.
Absolutely. And that's really why we have such wildly different accounts.
Yeah.
When armies that big clash, the logistics of just counting heads, it collapses immediately.
Right.
The challenge in really nailing these figures down comes from three main factors. First, you've got incomplete records. I mean, commanders are focused on fighting, not precise bookkeeping.
Of course.
Second, different methodologies. What does killed mean versus missing or permanently incapacitated?
Good point.
And third, there's a huge amount of post-war political revisionism. Both sides wanted to spin the numbers.
So those first reports are basically useless.
Pretty much. But modern historians have managed to land on a consensus range that probably captures the truth. We're looking at French losses somewhere between 28,000 and 40,000.
And the Russians?
Heavier. By almost every credible estimate, their casualties were heavier. Somewhere between 40,000 and maybe as high as 53,000 total.
Wow. Okay, so let's unpack the French side first. They needed that big, decisive victory to march on Moscow. What did Napoleon's command officially report right after they claimed a win?
Well, the initial figures the French put out were remarkably low, almost too clean. They cited 28,420 total losses.
That's very precise.
Suspiciously so. That broke down into about 6,500, 7,000 killed, and around 21,000 wounded.
You know, considering the scale and the fact that so much of the fighting was hand-to-hand around those Russian defenses, that number, it just always felt managed. spun.
And that skepticism is completely warranted. The really fascinating part here is understanding how that number gets bigger in later analysis. Historians now pretty much accept the total French losses were much closer to that 30,000 to 40,000 upper range.
So where do the extra 10,000 casualties come from?
It's almost entirely logistical. It's not a miscount on the day itself, it's what happened after.
Okay.
So initial reports, they almost never account for stragglers who just never rejoin their units, or, the fatally wounded who die a few days later. But the critical thing here is that the French army went straight from Borodino into the disastrous advance on Moscow, and then the even more disastrous retreat.
Okay, I see where this is going. So a soldier who's listed as wounded,
Right.
who might have survived if he was treated back in a stable hospital in, say, Germany,
Yeah.
he becomes a guaranteed fatality during that massive, brutal retreat.
Exactly. That's the key. When your army is fleeing for hundreds of miles in the freezing cold, medical support completely collapses. Those 20,000 plus wounded men, they were either abandoned, captured, or they died from untreated injuries, exposure, infection.
Days or weeks later.
Days or weeks later. So modern analysis, quite rightly, counts these men as Borodino casualties. And that's what pushes the true cost up towards that 40,000 mark. It's a retroactive adjustment that reveals the full price of that day.
That distinction is so important. The immediate battlefield cost versus the delayed logistical cost. But if you want a real sense of the intensity of the fighting,
Oh, yeah.
you just have to look at the losses to the command structure.
The officer corps.
The sources all highlight this. It's devastating. Up to 49 French generals were among the dead or injured at Borodino. 49.
It's an astonishing number.
For a single day of fighting. It tells you the Russians weren't just holding the line. They were aiming their fire directly at the command.
And that loss of 49 generals, it isn't just a statistic. It's operational paralysis. Generals are not supposed to fall in that kind of concentration. It means they were either being forced into the front lines by the sheer difficulty of the assaults.
Or they were just getting hit by indiscriminate fire.
Exactly. Or the Russian counter-battery fire was just sweeping across the entire battlefield, hitting anyone on a horse with devastating efficiency. Either way, whatever the troop numbers say, losing that many commanders immediately crippled Napoleon's ability to coordinate large-scale maneuvers after the battle.
Which sets the stage perfectly for the Russian side. They're defending their home soil, making this ferocious stand, and the sources are pretty clear they paid an even heavier price.
A much heavier price.
The consensus on Russian losses starts around 44,000 and goes up to about 47,000 total casualties.
At some of the highest, most inclusive estimates, they pushed that to 50,000. Maybe even 53,000 troops taken out of action.
And the breakdown of their numbers is really interesting, right? It tells a different story.
A very different story, and it gives you critical insight into their tactical position. So, of that massive number, roughly 30,000 were listed as wounded. But here's the crucial distinction from the French experience.
The aftermath.
The aftermath.
Yeah.
Because the battle was fought near their logistical heartland, a lot of those wounded troops were actually retrieved and eventually returned to duty. The campaign wasn't immediately abandoning them to die.
But their number of killed?
Their number of killed outright was horrifyingly high, around 15,000 men, just gone on the day. And this figure really reflects the ferocity of the French assaults, especially on key defensive positions.
The redoubts and the flèches?
The Great Redoubt and the Flèches, exactly. These earthen, arrow-shaped defenses, they were meat grinders. The Russian infantry were ordered to hold them at all costs, absorbing wave after wave of concentrated French fire and bayonet charges. They often fought until the entire unit was functionally annihilated rather than give ground.
So that's what drove the killed in action count so high. The absolute refusal to retreat. They were sacrificing bodies to deny Napoleon the ground.
Literally trading bodies for time.
And their command structure suffered in a similar way, though maybe not quite as badly as the French, proportionally.
Right. We know 29 Russian generals were killed or wounded.
And the most profound loss for them, both strategically and I think emotionally for the army, was Prince Bagration, one of their greatest commanders, mortally wounded.
And he succumbed to his injuries just days after the battle. The loss of Bagration was a definitive strategic setback. His fate, just like the 49 French generals, it just emphasizes that Borodino was a different kind of battle. The sheer density of the fighting meant that rank offered you zero protection.
None at all. Okay, so we've established the individual totals, but the real benefit of this deep dive is putting these numbers side by side. So let's look at the consolidated estimates and see what they tell us.
Yeah, let's compare them.
Starting with the most immediate, irreplaceable loss, the men killed in action. So sources put the French KIAs somewhere between, let's see, a low of 6,500 and a high of 10,000.
Right.
Now compare that to the Russians. Their number of killed ranges dramatically. It starts at 15,000.
And runs up to a staggering 30,000 in some upper range analyses.
That is a 2 to 3-fold difference in immediate fatalities. It's incredible.
It is. Now, if you look at the wounded, the raw numbers are actually pretty similar.
Yep.
You've got 20,000 to 25,000 for the French and maybe 25,000 to 30,000 for the Russians. The similarity there shows both armies were getting hit just as hard by artillery shrapnel, by musketry.
So the variance isn't in who got hurt, but what happened to them after they got hurt.
Exactly. Comes right back to that logistical factor we talked about. The French wounded were, for the most part, condemned to death by the retreat. The Russian wounded had a much, much higher chance of survival because they were near their own supply lines and hospitals.
So when we combine the full picture, the total losses, the French are standing firmly between 28,000 and 40,000.
Correct.
And the Russian total, across all the robust estimates, is heavier. It's ranging from 40,000 up to that 53,000 mark.
Yes.
But the truly defining data point, the one that tells the story of the battle's character, is that ratio of killed to wounded. Why do the sources suggest the Russians suffered such a higher proportional loss of men killed outright?
The implications of that are profound. In most battles, the attacking force usually suffers higher overall casualties. Here, the Russians, the defenders, suffer the higher overall casualty.
And a much higher proportion were in the killed category.
Right. And that happens when retreat is not an option.
Right.
It happens when your troops are explicitly ordered to stand their ground until they are annihilated. The French, even with their heavy losses, they had the tactical option to fall back from an assault, regroup, treat some wounded.
But the Russians were anchored.
They were anchored to those defensive positions, the redoubts, the flèches. That meant they just had to absorb massive, sustained punishment until the position was simply overrun. It tells you less about tactical failure and more about sheer defensive determination. They literally exchanged bodies for time and ground, and that's what drives the KIA count up so dramatically.
It paints just a horrifying picture of sacrifice. This wasn't just a high casualty battle. It was a demonstration of destructive commitment on a scale rarely seen.
Not in the 19th century, no.
So the essential takeaway from this deep dive is that Borodino was a staggering, almost incomprehensible casualty event. It cost the two empires somewhere between 68,000 and 93,000 troops.
In a single day of sustained combat.
Both armies were fundamentally gutted, but the Russians bore the heavier numerical burden in the end.
And this raises a really important question that historians are always grappling with. When the casualty figures are this high and the records are this contested, what is the impact on historical memory, on national narrative?
Right, because both sides claimed victory.
They both did. Napoleon, because he held the field at the end of the day, and the Russian commander, Kutuzov, because the French advance was basically halted without the total destruction of his army.
Yet the real cost reveals this monumental human tragedy, an operational disaster for both sides.
Absolutely. That sustained loss of high-ranking officers, 49 French generals, 29 Russian, it crippled their ability to command effectively for months, regardless of which army ultimately marched away. That sheer, exceptional intensity of command loss is what defines Borodino's place in history.
That officer loss alone is just, it's enough to destabilize an entire campaign. So for you listening, we really recommend you just take a moment and consider the logistical and human nightmare implied by these figures.
It's almost impossible to imagine.
Think about the immediate crisis. You have close to 90,000 men needing immediate medical attention or burial, all while one army is trying to advance and the other is trying to withdraw and resupply. That administrative collapse that followed the fighting, that's the true silent second cost of Borodino.
Welcome back to the deep dive. So today we are zeroing in on one of history's most brutal single-day battles, Borodino.
1812.
Exactly. But we're not really going to get bogged down in, the grand troop movements or the famous names. We want to look at the architecture of the battle.
The blueprint of the carnage, I think, is a great way to put it. We've been digging into this stack of sources on the Russian earthworks, and it's really clear.
They weren't just background scenery.
Not at all. Our mission here is to really understand how these temporary defenses, the redoubts and these things called flèches, were placed to be these deliberate, rigid funnels.
So they were channeling the attack.
Precisely. Napoleon's main assault didn't just stumble upon them. The Russian line was designed to force the French army into these designated kill zones.
So we're talking about battlefield engineering, This is applied physics, almost on a massive scale, and it really comes down to 3 key fortifications that anchored the whole thing.
Right. So if we start with the overall strategy, you see the Russians set up along what they called their second position. It ran for about 7 kilometers.
And this position was chosen very, very carefully.
Oh, absolutely. They used the Kolocha River, which is this sort of shallow, winding stream, as an anchor. It basically made any French advance predictable.
And the positioning itself, it's just so meticulous. You have the Russian center, which was their strongest point, anchored on the Kurgan Heights.
And that's not just a little hill, that's commanding high ground.
It gives you maximum visibility, maximum artillery coverage, right where the French have to advance.
Exactly. Then on their right wing, you have the village of Gorky, with its own batteries jutting out to discourage any flanking moves there.
But the real weak point, or the more complex area, was the left wing.
Yeah, the left wing was different. It was shielded by these dense forests over by Kutuzov village.
So the sources describe it more as being screened, almost like a makeshift fallback position, not a hard, strong point like the center.
And that's because the ground itself was so difficult. It was marshy, broken up. It just naturally complicated any large-scale movement.
Which was the key advantage for the defenders, wasn't it?
It was a massive advantage. That broken terrain, the ravines, the thickets, it breaks up attack formations. It magnified the effectiveness of their fortifications by forcing the French to tighten up and approach from very narrow, very predictable angles.
And this brings us right to the absolute hinge of the battle, Napoleon's decision.
Right, because his marshals saw this, Davout, one of his best commanders, and Poniatowski. They were arguing for a big enveloping move.
Go around the messy part.
Exactly. Go around that broken Russian left flank near Utitsa. They argued that a frontal assault on those earthworks would be just way too costly.
Napoleon.
He rejected them outright. He committed everything to a frontal assault, right up the axis of the main redoubt and the Flèches.
So he chose to attack them where they were strongest.
He essentially validated their entire defensive geometry. He confirmed that the path to victory for him had to go directly through the architecture the Russians had so carefully built. It's an incredible move.
Okay, let's start dissecting that architecture piece by piece, starting on that Russian left flank. The action there really begins 2 days earlier with the Shevardino Redoubt.
Right, the preliminary fight. The Shevardino Redoubt was this pentagonal earthwork built on a mound, a pretty robust structure.
Pentagonal, so 5 sides.
5 sides, yes. But the key thing to understand about Shevardino is that it was designed to be abandoned.
A disposable defense. Why build something so strong just to give it up?
It was a timer. It anchored their far left, but its main job was just to delay the French advance on September 5th.
To buy time.
To buy crucial time, yeah. It held out for most of the day, and those hours, those 24, 36 hours it bought, let the main Russian force finish building their primary defenses.
So the French spent all this blood and effort taking a position the Russians never planned on keeping.
Exactly. It was the warning shot. The real sustained fight on that left wing was for the Bagration Flèches.
And this is where the fighting just becomes catastrophic.
It really does. The Flèches, and there were 3 of them, sort of staggered, were named for Prince Bagration, who commanded that sector.
And structurally, they were different from Shevardino. These were arrowhead-shaped.
Like daggers pointing right at the advancing French.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. They jutted out from the main line near the Kolocha stream.
And crucially, they were open-backed earthworks.
Okay, open-backed, that sounds like a design flaw. I mean, if the enemy gets behind you, you have no cover.
It does, but it also tells you how confident they were that the enemy could only approach from the front. The open back meant they could reinforce and resupply their own troops very, very quickly from the main line.
So it's a trade-off. Speed of reinforcement for vulnerability if flanked.
A trade-off they were willing to make because that broken terrain made flanking so difficult.
And the French certainly tried to take them from the front. The sources here are just staggering. They say these 3 positions were hit by 7 separate major French assaults.
7 times. Imagine that. Huge columns of men being thrown at these earthworks over and over for just a few hours.
The accounts describe the smoke being so thick that visibility dropped to just a few yards.
And you're advancing into point-blank artillery fire from these protruding arrowheads. It turned the whole approach into a charnel house.
A meat grinder built into the terrain.
It was. The ground was supposedly unrecognizable by midday. They did eventually fall, but only after hours of this relentless, brutal fighting.
And it's here that the Russians suffered a terrible blow.
A huge one. It's where Prince Bagration himself, leading the defense, was mortally wounded.
Defending the very structures named after him.
It just underscores how central these defenses were to their whole plan. The commander of the flank dies defending them.
As terrible as that was, it was almost a prelude to the main event, which was happening at the dead center of the line. The Great Redoubt.
The Raevsky Redoubt, yeah. If the Flèches were daggers, this thing was an unyielding shield. This was the ultimate expression of their defensive geometry, sitting right on top of the Kurgan heights.
And this was a much more imposing structure, right? It had proper ramparts designed to take a real pounding.
Oh, absolutely. But its true strength was the firepower it concentrated in one spot. We're talking about 18 to 20 heavy guns packed inside the redoubt itself.
18 to 20 guns.
And that's not even counting the other batteries further back at Gorky that were supporting it.
So from the highest ground on the field, it could basically control fire across the entire main axis of the French advance.
It was the key. It strategically dominated the entire battlefield. And remember, this is exactly where Napoleon chose to attack.
He sent his strongest corps right at it.
Marshal Eugene's corps. So after seeing what happened at the Bagration Flèches, these troops had to throw themselves again and again against a position that was even stronger and even more heavily armed.
The attacks were just relentless.
A sustained sequence of assaults. The French actually took it briefly, but the Russians immediately counterattacked, and the fighting inside and around the earthworks was just chaotic and bloody. They knew if that redoubt fell for good, their center would crumble. It was the target of the most persistent, devastating attacks of the day.
So let's synthesize this for a moment. You have the pentagonal Shevardino buying time, you have the arrowhead Flèches acting as a meat grinder on the left, and then you have this massive central bastion, the Raevsky Redoubt, as the anchor.
And when you put those three together, you really see the Russian tactical genius here. Even though they lost each position eventually, the combined effect of that engineering and the terrain forced the French into this one narrow, prescribed channel of attack.
Right along the Kolocha River.
The battle stopped being a war of maneuver and it became a siege of 3 specific points.
And the structure of that defense. It just maximized the defenders' firepower and guaranteed the highest possible casualties in those choke points.
It's the brutal logic of that kind of defense. If you can't outmaneuver the enemy, you make them pay an absolutely unacceptable price to get through. The Russian engineering guaranteed that price would be exorbitant.
This has been a fascinating look at how military architecture can dictate the outcome of a battle. Let's recap the key takeaways for you listening. First, that disposable pentagonal Shevardino redoubt designed purely to buy time.
Then the incredible resilience of the 3 arrowhead Bagration Flèches, withstanding 7 different assaults.
And finally, the powerful, centrally located Raevsky Redoubt on the Kurgan Heights, armed with up to 20 heavy guns, which became the focus of Napoleon's entire effort.
And that after brings us to our final provocative thought. We know Napoleon rejected advice from experienced commanders like Davout and Poniatowski.
He ignored their calls for a flanking maneuver.
Yes, and committed to this incredibly costly frontal attack against the very geometry the Russians had built to bleed his army white.
So given the staggering casualties, given the fact the battle was basically a draw, what was his calculation?
Exactly. What does that decision tell you about the perceived need to crush the Great Redoubt? Was it strategic arrogance? A belief he could break any defense head-on? Or was there a psychological need to shatter the very heart of the Russian line, no matter the cost? That question goes beyond the dirt and timber and gets right into the mind of the commander. It's something to think about as you reflect on the price of Borodino.
A fascinating convergence of engineering, geography, and ego. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the structure of Borodino. We'll see you next time.